welcome everybody tonight. And just thank you all for joining us this evening. This is a preview of the 2021 state legislative session for Minnesota. We try to do this as an opportunity for our major donors and our trusted advisors to hear from two experienced lobbyists about the major issues this year in a kind of a small group where you will have a chance to ask questions and be part of a conversation. For those who don't know, our trusted advisors, a number of our board members are here as well, and our trusted advisors is a group of people who give us their time and advice on areas of their field of expertise on an ongoing basis. So it's kind of an advisory board without having the fiduciary responsibilities. So this is an opportunity to talk about a big picture perspective on legislative session that just started, 2 days ago, I think now. So I'm not planning to spend a lot of time this evening on the legislative goals of safe passage in particular, except I will give you a brief summary in a moment. And of course, I'm open to questions. I do want to mention on that point that we have a webinar planned for next Wednesday, which all of you are probably on our mailing list and would have received an invitation to. And Katy's going to help us with that as well. And that one will be more focused on the safe passage, let's call it the ground game for the legislative session. And its purpose is also to kind of gear up our supporters and our allies and our volunteers who will be actually, helping us work on the legislative session. So if you want to know more about the Safe Passage legislative agenda itself in more detail this year, then you are certainly welcome to join us there, and we'll probably ask you to do something at the legislative session. So that's coming up. But to cover our legislative agenda just at a high level before we get to the main topic, we're working again on getting legislation reintroduced this year that will require changes to a half dozen social work practices that we consider to be highly risky or dangerous for children. And many of you are familiar with this agenda. For example, giving parents advance notice of the initial child protection visit and interviewing children in the presence of the adults in the household. This year, though, we've been boosted by a substantial body of new research that is supporting our position. And we also have developed some key relationships with some of the leading researchers and better known names in the child welfare field who themselves are increasingly speaking out about the same concerns that we have with these practices. And as one other piece of the puzzle that fell into place this year, a class action lawsuit was settled this past year with Hennepin County, our largest county, that requires it to implement several of the key changes that we have been advocating for several years. So we see this as a multi-year process of educating legislators and the public to the fact that there are a number of practices that we are doing business in Minnesota that we're concerned about. And it's going to probably take more than one additional year to change them. But we are committed to continue to work on that and to get them passed either through legislation or by using the leverage from that to negotiate some kind of agreement until we get those reforms in place. We're also working with several partners to support their activities, particularly on bills that provide prevention and early intervention services. So we're active in supporting some partners as well. So that's my overview of the Safe Passage agendas. And with that, let me just introduce our presenters tonight. If you've been with us for this event in the past, you will recognize them. First is Maureen Shaver, who goes by Mo Shaver often, and she is a public affairs professional with over 25 years of experience in the public and private sector. And Mo has lobbied at the Minnesota legislature, representing various Minnesota corporations and trade associations, and has been a senior advisor to Republican elected officials. Maureen has been active in the campaigns of many Republican office holders and has been involved in particularly organizations that encourage the participation of women in the political process. Maureen has been a political commentator and political analyst. You may have seen or heard her, including for WCCO Radio, Minnesota Public Television, and Minnesota Public Radio, and is a regular contributor to Minnesota Public Radio. She's currently the principal of Shaver Public Affairs, which is a public affairs practice specializing in legislative strategy, lobbying, public affairs consulting, and political commentary. Now, Katy Sen, many of you know her, has been our lobbyist for a number of years. She has recently taken over as the department director for Messerly and Kramer's Government Relations Group. Did I describe that correctly, Katy? Yeah. And I also want to mention that as she takes over the reins of running her department, she has brought in Courtney Jasper to work increasingly with us on a day-to-day basis. Courtney, if you're there, can you wave at the crowd? And so we welcome Courtney to the mix here, and I look forward to working with her as well. So I want to take this. We wanted to make sure that we, just introduce you to the group, Courtney. Thanks for coming. So back to Katy. Prior to working to joining Messerly and Kramer, she served as the Deputy Chief of Staff for Governor Mark Dayton and oversaw the development of his biennial and capital budgets, provided strategic and policy advice, and also coordinated with federal representation in Washington on a number of issues. And prior to that, she served as the Director of Research in the House of Representatives DFL caucus. While in grad school, Katy worked for the Massachusetts Department of Children and Families, which was also one of my very first jobs in Massachusetts, the same department, and the Children's Trust Fund on child abuse prevention and protection issues. So she has some on-the-ground experience there. Katy has a master's degree in public policy from the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, so brings that great experience and background to us. So with that, Katy and Mo, I'm going to turn over the program to you. And so which one of you would like to go first?
I think I'm going to go first tonight and describe, first of all, good evening and thanks again for having me. I always appreciate this opportunity to visit with you as well as to work with Katy. She's just one of the best at the Capitol and I really enjoy it. And I'm looking forward to working with you too, Courtney. Katy and I split up our responsibilities a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Minnesota Senate tonight. She's going to describe a little bit about the House and the upcoming budget session as it relates to some of the issues that Safe Passages is interested in. But we find these to be more interesting if we give an overview and then answer the questions that are most interesting to you. Well, the two of us could talk about politics and government and what happened yesterday and everything, but we want to make sure that this is an interesting, that this information is what you're interested in. So I'm going to give a little overview. The Minnesota Senate, before the election, the Senate was 35 Republicans and 32 DFLers. After the election, it was 34 Republicans and 33 DFLers. A caucus needs 34 to control the gavels. So there was no change. The Minnesota Senate stayed in Republican hands. Once the election was over, two longtime Iron Range legislators, DFLers, Tom Bach, former majority leader, former minority leader, who last year midterm lost that to Senator Kent, and David Tomassoni. Senator Bach and Senator Tomassoni decided to create the independent caucus, and for most part of the caucus will caucus with the Republicans. There must have been an exchange. We all don't know the details behind the scenes of a loose agreement between the two of them, which probably includes voting for the Republican budget with Majority Leader Gazelka. In doing so, Senator Bach and Senator Tomassoni were given committee chairs. But Senator Bach and Tomassoni have also made it clear that there are certain issues they will not vote on like Republicans do. I think the gossip behind the scenes is, this might have been a little tentative agreement. So when you're looking at a few things to watch at the Capitol, one of them will be to see where Senator Bach and Senator Tomassoni end up in the negotiations. Why were the Republicans interested in doing this? When you have just a 34-33 majority, one person can control the caucus, and there are a few members that in the past had some opportunity to do that. So Senator Gazelka and a few of his team decided that it was better to add two to the mix, so they weren't stuck with just that one vote majority. The Senate, the second part I wanted to talk about is the Senate and what I'm calling the COVID session. The Senate majority desperately wants to get back to normal, as they say, and meet in person. The Minnesota House has made it clear, Speaker Hortman has made it clear that they will stay in a virtual session until the vaccination is widely available, which may not mean that they stay through the end of session, which is May 17th. But so as we look, that in itself has just set up a dynamic between the two bodies that's already making a little bit of friction. So expect to hear about that often in the Minnesota Senate, as well as wanting to eliminate the governor's emergency powers. In the Senate, there are more committees than there have been, and they are smaller. The thought being that they could meet then in their very large hearing rooms in person, with senators being in person. We're talking about, erecting some of the separators. It's complicated. They want to do it hybrid right now for the first 3 weeks, though my understanding is that they will be doing all by Zoom hearing. But it sounds very process oriented, but the reality is it is very hard to do this business. And, if you're a lobbyist, you need a lobby to lobby. and part of that is just the opportunity to see and come into contact, have small decisions made without it always having to be set up by Zoom or otherwise. And again, I think it's also reflective a little bit of what has gone on since the pandemic has come to globally. And again, that is going to continue to make everything more challenging. We even had quite a conversation. Today was the first day the Senate took up any thing this session, and they went to pass their rules. And they had a disagreement about whether there should be a mask mandate. When you're starting out that way, and people have very, very strong opinions on both sides, that just is going to make everything a little bit more challenging. And so what does it mean when everything's more challenging? You probably get less done. This is a budget session. And that in itself, it's about a $48+ billion budget that we'll attempt to pass. Of course, the House is Democrat, the Senate's Republican, the governor is a Democrat. And that divided government means that unless both bodies agree on something, this is outside the budget, but of course this will come into play with the budget, it's unlikely that it will move forward. The Senate, Katy asked me to talk a little bit about the priorities for the Senate. The Senate Majority Leader has kept their session priorities very compact. The Majority Leader stated this week it would be the priorities would be to pass a budget without raising taxes and look at the issue of election integrity. Although I think if the fortunes of President Trump wane after yesterday's attack on the Capitol by Trump supporters, that issue may tend to fade away. November 4th began, unfortunately, for those of us who don't want to watch, who don't want to think about this yet, but it did begin the 2022 election. And as Katy and I both know, we've worked in a governor's office when he was preparing to run for re-election. Governor Walz's agenda will certainly have an eye to his 2022 re-elect. So basically, I tell my clients and anybody else that asks the question, you have to put the filter of that on everything that happens in St. Paul. And this will be complicated because Senate Majority Leader Gazelka is contemplating running for governor. So the two people across the table, along with Speaker Hortman, will be negotiating with someone that, within 6 months, they may be putting up negative ads. It's going to be complicating. Negotiating a biennial budget in the middle of a global pandemic with your potential campaign opponent, it's going to be an interesting dance. I guess finally, we have to also acknowledge the divided government. This will be my 26th session, either in government or lobbying, and I expect it will be the most unique. It's going to be virtual. The House is Democrat, the Senate's Republican. They're going to attempt to pass a $48+ billion budget where right now we have a deficit of about $1 billion, although we're going to get another forecast, and with the infusion of some more federal money, that may not be quite as bad of a deficit. And looming over all of that is redistricting. Of course, every 10 years we redistrict, we draw new districts in Minnesota. We're waiting patiently for the population data and the census information, but Minnesota is on the cusp of losing a congressional seat. That doesn't matter as much to legislators, but it upsets the apple cart if we go from 8 to 7 seats, and then Minnesota legislators are going to be anxious about their seats. We have a rural-urban, ex-urban divide in this state. You know, the rural part, the greater Minnesota, is primarily represented by Republicans, and the urban and suburban areas are primarily represented by Democrats. Because of where the population sits in this seat, there's estimates that it could be a loss of 6 to 8 House seats. That's a lot out of 134 to the urban and ex-urban area. That is going to, it itself, again, upset that apple cart. So it's all of this under an election looming and the umbrella of a global pandemic and a very challenging end to the Trump presidency and Democrats' complete control in DC. It's just going to make for an unpredictable start to the session, which is my way of saying I'm not going to give you a lot of predictions because they're probably going to be wrong by the end of session. So as I tell my clients at the end, all you can do right now is stay tuned. Katie, did I miss anything?
No, I think you've done a really good job laying out kind of where we're at. So I'm going to take the House side and just kind of build on what Mo said. Obviously, the House is under Democrat control, so they have some different priorities and some different dynamics. And House and Senate, last night when I was watching everything happening in DC, I heard a reporter asking a question about, you know, does the interaction between the two bodies. And I was thinking about how often they sort of pretend like the other one doesn't exist until the very end and really do their own thing. So they each have their own personalities and dynamics. So I'll start kind of talking about, you know, well, before I jump into that, I just want to say thank you for having me. And Mo, thank you for doing this. The last time, another thing I talk about, people ask, when was the last time a Republican won statewide election? And it was when Mo was helping that person try to win statewide election under Tim Pawlenty. So she's definitely one of the really bright political minds in our state. And also just have to say, it's so great working with Rich and his staff. And when I worked for Mark Dayton, Rich was really, truly the driver of the Child Welfare Task Force that came together. And his work with reporters and Safe Passage's work, getting attention to what was happening in Minnesota, really had made huge changes in the child welfare system that hadn't been, I mean, I had nothing like that had happened in years. And I think, you know, some of the challenges we face now are, you know, dealing with a little bit of the backlash because it was such a significant change. And as institutions are adjusting, you know, we're feeling that pushback. So I always joke with Rich that his best and worst quality is his impatience for change. He wants things to happen, things that should happen to happen faster. And that's unfortunately not always the way things work at the Capitol, even though we do our best. But he's a great advocate for this issue. And so, you know, we really love working on this issue with him. And my colleague, Courtney, if you're lucky, her dog Betty might make an appearance. I've seen her yelling at someone. I'm pretty sure that's her new puppy, Betty, who's probably barking in the background here and there. But she's a great addition to the team that's working at the Capitol. So I just wanted to give those shout outs. So on the House side, I mean, I think given everything that's happened since March and all the turmoil and, you know, all the money spent on elections, the biggest surprise is that it's really kind of the status quo in Minnesota. I mean, in the House, as Mo was saying, the majority changed very little, despite some interesting dynamics. But in the House, the majority had been 75-59 with Democrats in control. Now it's 70-64, Democrats still in control. None of the leaders changed, which is also unusual. Both the Senate leadership and the House leadership in all 4 caucuses stayed the same, which is kind of unusual. So it's really kind of surprising, given everything that's happened, that there really wasn't a lot of change. You know, we're also the only divided legislature in the whole country. We're the only state that is purple enough to pick one party for the House and a different one for the Senate. And so that just makes us unique and sets up a very interesting dynamic, which is not unusual to Minnesota, but is unusual nationwide. And then I think, you know, some of the impact of that election, and I guess some of the sort of interesting parts of the election. One is that I'm sure you've read about, Joe Biden really didn't have coattails. I think if you had had me on before the election, I would have been saying I thought the Senate was going to flip and be Democratic in Minnesota. I thought that and what did end up happening now, of course, the Senate is tied. The federal government, now the 2 seats in Alabama have flipped. But I think the overall, the Democrats nationally lost seats in the US House. And that was surprising to a lot of us that were watching elections, that there wasn't sort of a bigger shift. And I think also that Joe Biden won more Senate districts in Minnesota. So in Minnesota, because Democratic voters are so concentrated in Minneapolis and St. Paul, Democrats need to win more votes overall to take the majority than Republicans do to take the majority, simply because of how votes are distributed. There's more districts with 90% people that are Democrats than there are Republican districts that are 90%. And so that being said, even if you look at it by Senate district, Joe Biden outperformed local candidates who you would think could really appeal to their local voters. So some interesting dynamics, I think, for Democrats in particular to dissect. And it's been, as you all know, such a crazy year, continues to be, given what happened yesterday. There's a lot of analysis yet to be done on the election and what happened. But another impact on the election was the marijuana candidates. I think they won a pretty significant part of the portion of the vote. When you look at, if they had not been there, some of the Democrats probably would have won that lost. There were cases where the Democrat lost by a smaller margin than what the marijuana candidate won. And so in Shakopee, for example, there's an extremely conservative Republican who was elected, who beat Brad Tabke, and the marijuana party, I think, got a significant percentage of the vote there. Even in Angie Craig's race, in some of the federal races, those candidates picked up a lot of votes. So that sort of leads me to, what are some of the priorities that the House is looking at? And I think the House would say, similar to the Senate, their top priority is getting a balanced budget, passing a budget. I think because it's unknown what the February forecast will say, whether there's a surplus or not. I think there's definitely hints that Democrats are likely to raise revenue in their budget. I think they won't say that directly yet, because they kind of, if there's a surplus, then obviously that's a different story than right now when we're projecting a deficit. But I think either way, I would assume the Democrats will have revenue raisers. If for no other reason, there's some spending that they're going to want to do related to people that were hurt during the pandemic. And so I think in order to do that spending, they'll probably need to do some revenue raisers. And then I think, kind of contrasting with the Senate, you look at sort of their first bill introductions that were introduced the beginning of session, and they really relate to stopping the governor's emergency powers. So a COVID focus, but really different than the Democrats, where the Democrats' first bills are about assistance to people who've been hurt by COVID. So housing assistance, increasing MFIP, even money to Minneapolis for some of the civil unrest damage that was done. So they're definitely bringing different priorities to the table. But, to their credit, 2 years ago, these same leaders were able to get a budget passed. And I think the biggest question, as Mo said, is going to be that dynamic, especially between Governor Walz and Paul Gazelka. It feels like that relationship has frayed, I think, both for election reasons and also just because of really different approaches to what they think should happen in response to COVID and the pandemic. So those are some of the pieces that I wanted to hit on. Trying to think, am I missing anything, Mo, on the House side?
I think you hit it. And I think in terms of it, as I said before, I think we always, it's much more interesting to hear what questions you want us to ask. We don't have all the answers, but we point you in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rich, do you want, oh, there you go.
Well, I want to, encourage other people to ask questions first. I can jump in if we have a lag, but does anybody have something that they've been wondering about? It's kind of small group, so we can have a real conversation, and no worries about trying to, quickly get your point in. We have plenty of time.
You know, while people think about that, I could mention one thing I think is of interest to this group is the debate around getting kids back to school. And that's something we've been tracking because we know that when kids are not at school, they're more likely to be overlooked if they're suffering from abuse or neglect at home. And so there's a new education chair in the Senate, Roger Chamberlain, and the first hearing he had, I think it was yesterday, was about the impact of COVID on schools or on children. And there were lots of, there were lots of parents that were testifying, but also NAMI, the National Association for Mental Illness, testified with concerns. And so that'll be an issue we'll be tracking. And, with the different chair who's really focused on that, I think there might be some attention given to that subject.
Maybe you can say more about that, because my sense as not being, like an insider, is that that's an issue that can cut either way. And, that there can be parts of it that conservatives really support and parts that liberals support. We, as some of you know, have been really trying to push on that issue. And Katy's helped us get an audience with the deputy commissioner level people in the Department of Education, Children's Cabinet, and DHS, where we've been saying, look, the American Academy of Pediatrics has really been advocating hard for getting elementary school kids back in school, with the assumption that you do the things you're supposed to do in terms of avoiding the spread. So we end up in the position of an odd position of sort of saying, let's get kids back, even though we know there's some risk. But from all the stuff that we're seeing in the health world, that the risk is very small, and the consequences of not being in school are very large. So so I see that as kind of an odd issue that is, it's sort of like sometimes it's a conservative issue, sometimes it's a liberal issue, sometimes people push back in directions you don't anticipate. Is there anything you guys can say about that?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that you described specifically happened in that hearing, which is, you have Roger Chamberlain, who's a very conservative Republican, I would say. And then he paired up with the Parents Union, which represents students in Minneapolis and is liberal, and almost entirely people of color make up that organization, who are advocating for their kids who are in urban districts and they feel like are kind of being left behind during COVID-19. And so I think that was actually kind of both sides of that coalition came together at this hearing. And, they were critical of the teachers union, I think. So they both share that in common. And there's all kinds of political dynamics around that. And, and there's probably, ulterior motives too. But the overall message, is something that we obviously will be paying attention to during session and seeing how that plays out.
I think it's one of the classic, first of all, it's one of these issues we never would have seen without COVID. We wouldn't have had some of these challenges, but I think it's also a classic situation when you're doing what Katy and Courtney and I do in terms of lobbying is you almost have to take it out of the hands a little bit of the chairs and find a couple allies in between, because Roger Chamberlain I would put him in, he's very much a libertarian. He's not even a conservative Republican, but he has some pretty tough ideas, and yet he, I'm sure very much feels, like many, that we've got to get kids back into school for all the reasons they outlined and all the allies he made yesterday. The problem is the teachers unions, who are a very powerful force, especially in DFL politics, Education Minnesota, they're bringing a different perspective to the table, but they have that political piece. So it's almost like, I don't know if Denise Specht, who runs that organization, and Roger Chamberlain could ever find common ground, because the political disagreement is so thick. But what you could do is find a Democrat in the House and a Republican in the Senate who could almost be the emissaries to those two organizations to say, in the end, we all want kids back in school, including the teachers. And one of those things is to be making sure that the teachers end up staying on that priority list for the vaccination. That's the public health piece of this is really important. So it's one of these things where you can see the bucket, all the ways to make some progress. I'm not going to say it's all going to happen and everybody's going to be happy on both sides, but But you also have to look at some very strong political personalities in this whose motives may not all be just to get the kids back to school. Does that make sense, Katie? A little bit?
So Deborah,
Can
you
I
wanted to
ask-
jump in, want to make sure you, yeah, go
I
ahead.
just wanted to jump, I had a question about that because a lot of the policies about school openings are happening at the school district level. So what can be done at the state level that the legislature would have a hand in?
Well, I think the governor does have, and maybe Mo knows the details better than I do, but the governor has put out several executive orders related to thresholds for school districts. He's loosened that significantly in the latest orders that he's given. I'm not sure I don't think there was specific legislation that was being highlighted. I think it was a little bit of wanting to have a chance to, criticize the governor and frustration with his emergency orders. I'm sure that you could pass legislation, requiring or, making changes that would facilitate it. But it was really more the hearing, my understanding, it felt more like it was just hearing what the impact had been of school closings.
Well, and I think, underlying all of this is one of the biggest pieces of the budget, which of course is the education budget. So, teachers care a great deal about making sure schools are well funded. And Republicans in the Senate and House in particular want to make sure that there's different options than Education Minnesota supports necessarily for how we educate children. And also, it's a little bit about the purse strings. So the specific legislation to authorize certain things in certain school districts absolutely is being left there, but they have a pretty big leverage piece that if they could find some agreement on Education Minnesota cannot ignore the education chair in the Minnesota Senate because he's going to be making a lot of decisions about where their budgets come from. At the same time, there's more Democrats in this budget, three-legged stool. And so, Republicans are going to have to find a way to get to find common ground. I actually think some of the ways they could is again, making sure the teachers stay in priority order as from a public health perspective, we move forward. And also there's going to be both federal and some state dollars just to get the vaccination out there and into people's arms. And I think as we're seeing over the last couple of weeks, that has been one of the challenges that we're having as a country about, getting the vaccinations through the supply chain actually into people's arms, and money will help that at some point. And I think personally, Minnesota is going to be on the front edge of that. I also believe that with the change in administrations, that's going to go much more smoothly. And so I'm very confident in that, but that'll bring down some of the pressure if we can get those teachers vaccinated.
So if I can sum, it's basically, there may not be a specific bill, but there's a lot of politics going on, which will kind of leak into budget issues and other conversations that end up, at the end of the session with some outcomes.
Yes.
Something like that.
Yeah, I think that's a good assessment.
So who else has something they want to throw in the mix here? Greg? Yeah.
The legislative agenda, so to speak, for safe passage, are there specific bills that those items are already included in? Are we still looking for sponsors for our issues? Where's that process at?
Well, and that's, let me give you a brief kind of picture. That's kind of what I was saying at the beginning, is that we'll cover that more in the webinar next week. And I wanted to kind of keep this at the broader level, but essentially we're trying to get sponsors. I do want to touch on it. I want to respond. We are in the process of trying to get our bill reintroduced that we had last year in the Senate, which would change those 5 or 6 family assessment practices. The House is going to be more challenging, but we still may be able to do that. We've got a couple of options we're working on. I think it's going to be difficult to get it through all the way in this year, because there will be a lot of opposition from, a number of both on the left and on the right. We have opposition. There's people in the Posse caucus, that are, skeptical of changes that the counties don't support. And there's people in the, the homeschool and anti-vaxxer group that have the ear of some key senators that would oppose it as well. So we just really using that. And even if we don't have that bill reintroduced, we're going to talk about those topics. We're also, I don't see Patty Moses on the call, but Patty Moses and Jane Random have been working with, and I have been working with each other and Kathleen Blatz on a bill that has been introduced to lower the barriers to foster care licensing, so that a lot of felonies that have been a bar to being a foster parent would be reduced or eliminated. And the bill started out, we've been negotiating that for a good year now. And that started out with a lot of things that we just couldn't live with. And we've kind of negotiated to the point where we think we can support it, and we can get Kathleen Blatz to support it. And then she will be able to talk with some of the Republicans about, okay, we've got this bill to a certain point. And that bill may also be a vehicle for raising some question about clarifying foster care standards, which would be, can still possibly be folded into the bill. That's kind of complicated, but basically that's a big piece we work on. And then we've been talking regularly with people like Close Gaps by 5 about supporting early childhood development. And there's a guy who is the recently retired president of Mitchell Hamlin Law Schools, working on a big bill to bring in some prevention, early intervention funding that a number of people are working with it, including us. So we'll be supporting those bills if they get to that point, or if not, we'll be talking about those issues, with as the bills get talked about by our partners. So those are so it's basically about prevention, early intervention, foster care licensing stuff, and our own traditional agenda about social work practices.
And Rich, maybe related to that, but still kind of bigger picture, one thing I didn't touch on was the committee changes in the House. And one of the biggest changes is the House has essentially broken up their Health and Human Service Committee, which had just such a huge portion of the budget and was a little unruly, I think, frankly, for the conference committee at the end to deal with so many issues in just one conference committee. So they've split up. Tina Liebling was chair of the HHS Finance Committee, and they've split the Finance Committee in two. And now Representative Schultz from Duluth has a portion of that committee, and Representative Liebling has another portion of the committee. And they've also created a preventative health policy committee, which will be interesting to see, how they work, especially with Dave Pinto's sort of early childhood committee, how they think about things like nurse home visiting and other sort of prevention programs that are things we've really supported in the past. I think having that issue broken up is helpful in spotlighting more issues. And then they also have a preventing homelessness committee. So some of the issues that were in Health and Human Services have kind of been broken up, and that will impact how our bills move through that process and who are the deciders. And Rena Moran was the HHS Policy Committee Chair, and now she's Ways and Means Committee Chair. So,
but there still is a Health and Human Services Policy Committee, right? Is it, because it sounded like you're saying it was broken into two finance pieces, but there's still a policy piece somewhere.
I believe they're doing the policy in their finance and policy combined.
In each of those.
I'm looking.
Yeah, I think, and I haven't sat through any of them yet, but I think Representative Liebling's committee is being called both policy and finance. And then Representative Schultz's, she's got what pairs up more with Representative Abler, I think, wouldn't you say, or Senator Abler?
Yeah, I think they tried to, the Senate doesn't have a policy committee. They have, Abler and Benson both have finance committees, and the House has a similar dynamic now, because what they said they found was happening was bills were having to get heard in multiple committees with a lot of overlapping. So I think they're now more combined policy finance type of committees on certain issues.
But I think, Katie, the preventative health and some of the and the homelessness, some of these committees that are going to be kind of divisions of these Health and Human Services Committee. I mean, it's the largest budget in the piece of the state budget. or that and education. And I think actually you might get more attention to some of your issues, because when you have a chair that kind of hangs on to an issue, they end up being on the conference committee. So I always call them like your fairy godmothers in there pushing for your issues. So.
But I think this conversation is a really good example of why you need a lobbyist, because
We're still trying to sort it out too.
if you say, where does my bill need to go and who do I need to talk to? I mean, it's a labyrinth, and it's a changing labyrinth. The labyrinth gets reconfigured all the time. So it's really hard to even know which committee or committees your bill needs to get through. And of course, they need to get through certain committees by a deadline in March.
Right.
And so, yeah, it's complicated, and it doesn't get simpler as the years go by. So
I asked one of the chairs of one of the new committees like 2 weeks ago what accounts they have, like which, and they were still waiting to get that. So it is, a lot happens in a very short time period. Hopefully they know by now, but.
And we're happy to answer any questions too about other issues that are going to be before the legislature.
I have a question. Does the governor have a specific legislative agenda that he would like to get through this session? And if so, how can you tell?
His budget is due to come out on January 26th, and that will essentially outline his legislative priorities. He may give some hint of what's in that before then. Sometimes governors unveil issues kind of one at a time, the big ones. But that's when we'll really find out what his priorities are, because that will be when his budget's revealed.
And where they spend the money is where their priorities are.
Is there nothing that doesn't have a dollar sign attached to it?
I shouldn't say that. I mean, there are things like sports betting and legalizing recreational marijuana. And, there are certainly policy issues that don't. And the governors will be talking about, he's got energy policy and other things like that. But as Katie suggested, it comes out as, especially in a budget year like this is, it will come out as part of that process.
Okay.
And he's the first out of the gate.
And he has to use the forecast that came out in November. And so, he's working off of an assumed deficit. The legislature can wait until the February forecast before they put together their budget. And so that deficit could be lower, bigger, gone.
Well, yeah. And then, again, it's such an unusual year, but when you don't even know who the United States Congress who's going to be in charge until Tuesday of this week, the conventional wisdom is that a Congress and a president from the same party is probably going to have a little more a more robust COVID package and assistance packages coming back to the states than if the Republicans had kept the Senate. And that has implications for our budget process too. And of course, Governor Walz won't have the opportunity yet to know what that might look like, but by the time the legislature puts their budget together after the February forecast, we may have a better indication of what kind of assistance will be coming as it relates to COVID. And that's not just COVID. That's not like vaccinations and testing. That's eviction money. That's transportation money. That's clearly education money. It's a lot, and it could make up a difference for some of the places where the deficit is in Minnesota.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So if that happens and there's a little more money because of the federal piece, are there any significant issues in human services that might have a chance of getting some funding this year, that people are, like early learning scholarships or whatever? Or is it just forget about it time, wait till next year?
I think they've been so prepared for a deficit. There has not been a lot of, at least public discussion that I've heard about spending items. I mean, if you think back before the November forecast, the last estimate was in May, and they were projecting a $5 billion deficit. So, no one had really, and then it was the election and they were putting committees together. So I think even just being down to a $1 billion deficit has changed sort of the thinking from, well, there's probably going to be some tax increases to, well, maybe there won't be. And if there's a surplus, then that changes again. So, you know, I can't think off the top of my head of any. I think what will happen is in the education area, there's always a desire to do an increase, and no matter, you know, bipartisanly. And so I think it's how do you come up with that 1% or 2% adds up to, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars pretty quickly. And the education budget does include things like early childhood scholarships, so those things get easier to do. The Senate typically, my guess is they will have a negative target for HHS. They will have cuts because that's where they see opportunities for savings. And so anything that's in the HHS committees is always harder to get an increase for. So obviously scholarships are in education. That's a little bit different dynamic than things that are on the HHS budget side.
I agree with everything Katie said, and I would just keep an eye first on what's that Minnesota piece that might come from the feds. Is it targeted to any specific areas? And again, you know, the political reality, as Katie described it, we're a purple state when it comes to the legislature. People like that balance, and so if you can always, when you're putting your agenda together, make sure that it's something. Both, I mean, if you go and advocate for something in safe passages world that, and I know you're a little more unique, but that only Democrats from a spending perspective support, that in itself is just going to put the other side on defense. And the same with perhaps what happened in Senator Chamberlain's committee yesterday. I think what it is to find an advocate to say, we know, you know, we're setting realistic expectations, but if you're looking to make progress in investments in our children and, you know, K-12 and stuff, drawing the connection to how, first of all, finding a hook for both sides, you're going to have more success, especially in a leaner environment. So you've got to find that, and frankly, you have to be very, very connected to the politics of it. Because these Senate, you know, we always, back in the day, we always said the senators were statesmen and women in the first 2 years, and then they were just like everybody else in their second year, in the second part of their term, because they were running for re-election. Well, they've just run for re-election, and they're going to do it again, and in new districts. So again, you want to avoid anything that's going to quickly stir up the politics of your issue, if at all possible.
Right, and that's always a challenge for us because our work is by nature controversial. And I think for people who have been with us, and certainly Katie knows this, you know, it might seem counterintuitive to some, but our greatest support has been the Republicans on the Senate side, I would say, Katie, wouldn't you? And where we run into, although then we get to a certain point and the homeschooler group comes in and says, you know, you're interfering with parents' rights, you know, and we always say, well, what about children's rights, you know, because they're citizens too, or, you know, they're in the government too. And then on the House side, the issue is, you know, the disproportionality in child protection and foster care. So many disproportionate number of African-American and children of color and indigenous that anything that might tend to bring more people into the system generally gets opposition from the progressive side as well. So we're kind of bracketed by the, you know, the progressives and you know, extra uber progressives and just main progressives, I guess, nowadays. And then the like homeschooler kind of level conservatives and libertarians. So we're really in a tight box, but the other side of that coin is there's a lot of people who are not in either of those camps that get what we're doing. So it's just you know, it's a tricky environment.
And finding those stalwarts champions, I think more than ever, as I watched the opening sessions in the House and Senate, and I don't know what you thought, Katie, you know, people are finding their bucket, and the more you can find the workhorses of the legislature who don't necessarily get up and talk at every session, so they can do some of that work behind the scenes. Because if you find the advocate, I mean, Dave Pinto's a perfect example. You know, he's just he's a workhorse. He clearly has a political bent, but he works well with all of his colleagues behind the scenes. And he is not standing up on the floor every session and putting a political position out there. And there's others on the certainly on the Senate side that would fall in that same category. But especially when your issues are a little not always predictable politically, like I'm learning yours are. I think it's good to find those workhorses who can behind the scenes help you say, no, this one you can support, you can help.
And
if
I
you-
think that's been one of our advantages, is that Julie Rosen has been our champion really in the Senate. And so on the Senate side, she's been very helpful as a convener, and, and I think on the House side, the dynamics have just changed so much since the Child Welfare Task Force. And I think it wasn't it wasn't as partisan until so many changes were made that brought so many more kids into the system. And there's really kind of been a backlash on the House side. And so for us, it's helping find that middle ground, and also frankly, helping feel like, how are we going to address the disparities? And everyone wants the right kids to stay at their house and the right kids to be removed if needed. And no one wants to remove a kid because they didn't wear a jacket to school or whatever. Some of the examples people bring up, everyone wants the right kid to be in the right place so that they're safe. And it's just a matter of figuring out, how do you do that? And it's very complicated, and there's very strong emotions involved. And when you have parents coming to testify and you have no way of knowing like what the actual situation is, emotions run high very quickly. So it's a hard issue, but that's why why we work on it.
For people who aren't in the mix all the time, who are some of these people, particularly mentioned Julie Rosen, she's a key person, or anybody else that you've brought up that I'm not thinking of at the moment.
Yeah, so Julie Rosen's the chair of the Finance Committee in the Senate. She was the author of the Vikings Stadium bill. She was the author of the bill related to going after opioid manufacturers. She is sort of known for she was on the Child Welfare Task Force, and she worked really closely with
Kathleen Blatz.
With Kathleen Blatz and with, oh my gosh, who's the legislator from Mankato who's retired, Rich?
Kathy Sharon.
And Kathy Sharon, who's a Democrat. And so she's sort of known for doing hard things and pushing and having uncomfortable conversations. And so she's a great advocate in the Senate.
And they all have to bring their budgets before. So it's always good to have the person who's going to be in the room in the final about the budget, carry your bills.
So, and I think we're kind of juggling all this and trying to figure out who is who, and so is everybody else. So I just think of, people at the Capitol with all these flies buzzing around their head, with people trying to say, pick me. And it's just, just a lot of competition. And we've also, some of the people who have been our champions have left, people like Susan Allen, who is a Native American, who was a legislator who carried our bills. She's gone. So then you have to start over. And Dave Pinto is great, and he's my representative, but he's not exactly on the right committee. He's not the chair of Health and Human Services. He's the chair of Early Childhood. So, yeah, so we're really, I think, in very good shape in the Senate, and we're just kind of trying to rebuild our champions in the House.
Anybody have any questions about anything going on at the legislature, not just your issues? We're happy to.
Yeah, right, exactly, yeah.
Nobody's asked about sports betting, Katy. Katy and I got to know each other because she represents the Minnesota Twins and I represent the Minnesota Wild. And so we do.
Did you get us all tickets? That's the question.
Hopefully they'll be playing again.
Yeah, well, hopefully.
Yeah, that's the first step.
I'm afraid we gotta really be at a strong place with the vaccinations before we're gonna be worrying about that anymore.
Well, maybe you can talk a little bit about where medical providers are at and where they might get in the mix here. People who, physicians and, emergency providers and nurses and all those folks are on the front line. Do they have anything significant going on in the session this year?
I do some healthcare. I mean, you and Katy, I'm not, they've had a couple big years in the last few years. They've worked on an issue called prior authorization and drug price transparency that were big to the provider communities. But of course, they've just been trying to keep their head above water, you know, between the hospitals and everything that's gone on with COVID. And frankly, the model for delivering healthcare is changing. And some of that's going to be positive. It's one of those disruptors that's going to come out of COVID that's good, but it's changing the dynamics, the way healthcare is financed especially for physicians, and also how it's delivered.
And how is the U of M going to come out during this this year, do you think?
The university, or you're not talking about healthcare?
No, yeah, I'm switching gears. Okay, I'm adding one. What about the University of Minnesota? What are their prospects?
Well, and Mo can jump in if she has any connections to. I don't work specifically on them. I would say they've had an uphill battle in recent years getting additional funding, kind of, you know, especially from Republicans. And so I think they got some bonding money, which was good, but it's always, you know, there is a deficit. And so it's been a hard sell for them. I don't know, Mo, if you know more about that.
Well, I do some work for the Minnesota Private College Council. So I spend time in and work primarily on the state grant program, which is Minnesota's Pell Grant. But the thing about COVID that's not been great for higher education, because it's one of these really unique niche areas at the legislature, is that with these smaller committees, there's a smaller amount of people that are making the decisions. And I would say that the two committees, if you know, the biggest issues the higher ed committee faces is funding our Minnesota state system, and funding the University of Minnesota, and funding the state grant program. Let's just say the U has an uphill climb in terms of the people that were appointed to the committees. There's a new David Tomasoni, one of the independent caucus persons, is the new chair of the higher ed committee in the Senate. And the committee got smaller in the House. And when you look at if you represent an area that has a Minnesota state school, you really care about that. And so you didn't do as well, in my expectation, from the appointments to those committees. So they've got a little bit of work ahead of them. Hopefully the governor's good to them.
Mm-hmm. Anything else?
Well, just on, I guess I just want to throw one or two other areas out there. You've covered some of it, but can you summarize the business community, what their you know, aspirational goals are for this session? Chamber of Commerce, those, you know, executive.
You want me to start, Katie?
Yeah, why don't you start, Mo?
I think the interesting thing about the chamber is, you know, this was a year we had 7 special sessions because of the, you know, the capability that the governor promised to bring them back every month when he renewed his emergency powers. And that was just really taxing. We didn't quite get the break that we used to do. And we worked pretty hard during that session, so we don't get that off session the same. It's a little exhausting. But in the last special session, they passed a significant bonding bill, and they passed a piece that on some tax reform called Section 179, which is really in the weeds, but really important in Minnesota, small to mid-sized businesses, as well as farmers. And they had been working on that for 2 years, the business community. And so, and then we passed some significant COVID support for small business in Minnesota, which I think we'll continue to do more of. So ironically, Rich, much of their agenda that costs a lot of money and that's the most important to the business community was taken care of in this last special session. And there's just sort of a rhythm at the Capitol. You know, once you get something big done, then you got to pause a little bit. And so I think the business
You don't know anything about that, do you, Rich?
Exactly.
Yeah, the pause is getting a little long. But
Yeah, there is that. But I think that the definition of what pause is too. But so I think what you're going to see is mainly the business community trying to make sure that that there's not revenue raisers in this budget, and that can come from individual taxpayers to corporate income tax to all across the board. And then also probably looking for some relief in the area of liability protection as we kind of roll out of this COVID. But I would expect that they will keep their fingers crossed that if nothing happens, the business community will be pretty happy. Paid family leave is something, it's just inch in there, it's been laid bare by the pandemic. And I think the DFL House would absolutely like to make some progress there. But that's usually not been supported by the business community. So those are a couple of their two or three of their big issues. Did I miss anything, Katie?
No, I think you hit it. And I mean, I guess they've been in I've heard some Republicans sort of grumbling that they thought the business community had been too easy on the governor. And then of course the Democrats feel like they haven't been helpful. So they do kind of in the COVID, I think they're in a little bit of a tough spot because the governor is the one making the decisions. And I think the chamber is not typically, natural allies of Democrats, and in elections really support the Republicans. So it's always a tricky relationship, but there's such a huge stakeholder in the state, and especially with COVID and so many businesses being impacted, they've really worked together during interim. So, that's just a different dynamic that I think has changed things a little bit.
Yeah, I agree.
And I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but I see, we have a couple people on the call from the U, and I want to see if you have any other thoughts to add, from the Humphrey Institute and the Institute of Child Development. If you have any further questions or just, comments about what you've heard so far that you want to throw in the mix, as I say, not to put you on the spot, but if you do, just, give us a wink. No, it says, or Faith, huh? All right, well, just wanted to leave that opportunity there. Other major areas or questions you all want to know about? Well, let's see. Well, we have gone an hour, so that kind of went quickly. I just want to say thank you so much, Katie and Mo. This is great. We should do this once a month. Really, it's just so much fun. And everybody for participating tonight. There were some great questions, and this is one of my favorite events of the whole year. So we will see you guys, hopefully many of you, during the session.
Thanks for having me, and be well, everybody. Stay safe.
Yeah,
Okay.
great to see everyone. Thank
All
you.
right. Okay.
Bye
See you on the webinar.
See you at the webinar. Yeah.
And Courtney will be there too, so you get a new perspective.
Right. Okay. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.